Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this event with Jelani Cobb presenting his book, The Matter of Black Lives, Writing from the New Yorker, in conversation with Errin Haines. Again, thank you for being here tonight. Through virtual events like this one, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community far and wide. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. And as always, our full event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from your home. Also, this event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. Also, this evening's event will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many questions as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase tonight's featured book, The Matter of Black Lives, on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Jelani Cobb is a historian and professor of journalism at Columbia University. He has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 2015, and in 2015, he won the Sidney Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism. He frequently writes about race, politics, history, and culture. He is the author of 3 previous books, and his articles and essays have appeared in The Washington Post, The New Republic, and Essence, among many other publications and anthologies. Most recently, he served as co-editor of tonight's featured book, The Matter of Black Lives, Writing from the New Yorker, which brings together reporting, profiles, memoir, and criticism from the New Yorker over the past century to examine this country's relationship with race. In a starred review, Kirkus Reviews calls it an essential volume for readers interested in the Black past and present, as all readers should be. And also in a starred review, Library Journal writes that Cobb and Reminick have assembled a dialogue across generations of New Yorker contributors that encourages readers to engage with the nation's history of racism and potential for change. He'll be joined in conversation tonight by Errin Haines, award-winning journalist and editor-at-large of The 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. We're so happy to have them both here with us tonight. Without further ado, I will turn the digital podium over to Jelani and Errin.
Hi, Errin.
Hey there, thanks so much for doing this. Jelani and I share a screen for those of you who are joining us quite a bit. And fun fact, we used to share an apartment building in Atlanta, though absolutely not the same apartment. So just to clarify, I want to get that out there, don't want to confuse folks. Anyway, listen, Jelani, The Matter of Black Lives, I've got my copy. It is huge, it is voluminous, and it feels as consequential as it is heavy. So let me congratulate you, my friend, on this book before we get started.
Thank you. So, we were being very considerate when we put that book together because we were thinking, people are still working out from home.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you this book. You can read it for a while. You can then turn around and work out with it. If you want to curl it, or bench press it,
Yes.
It is a multi-use volume in that
Absolutely
way.
Helpful to me as I'm propping up my laptop for a television appearance.
There it is. I mean, there's just no end to the uses for this book.
Doing so many different areas of work, much like Black people in this country. So let's start by seriously, I want to ask you, I've read all of the pieces that you have written in here, but really was introduced to and had a chance to revisit so many others. Talk to me about just kind of how the idea for this anthology came together, why pull all these pieces together in this anthology now?
Mm-hmm. So, last summer of 2020, while bedlam was sweeping the country in response to the death of George Floyd, the New Yorker did something that was really insightful, really thoughtful, which is that they republished James Baldwin's Letter from a Region in My Mind. And some people know that essay. If you don't know that essay by that title, that letter was also the cornerstone. Really, it makes up about 85% of Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. And so the piece, spoke, autobiographically to Baldwin's time in Harlem, to the kinds of institutional failures, that defined life in Harlem at that point in time, and then culminates, decades later in his life, in this dinner he had with Elijah Muhammad, and him really using the frame of his own life as a mechanism for understanding what Elijah Muhammad represented and what the Nation of Islam represented at the time. And of course, its most fiery and recognized spokesman, Malcolm X. And so that piece, which remains an astounding piece of writing, it appeared in 1962. So it is, just about 60 years old, and it still has the same sort of percussive impact that it had when the New Yorker ran it in 1962. So after that, we got into this conversation about what kind of reading could be helpful or could be useful to people as we were kind of navigating this moment. And we started with first it started with David, who I will henceforth be referred to as Remnick. It started with Remnick and I just tossing around things that we thought were important. And it was like, oh, remember this piece? And it was like, yeah. And I was like, oh, what about this piece here? And this. And so we started just kind of tossing them around. And we then got into a conversation with Errin Overby, who's the archivist, and she did a more extensive, detailed list. And then we just start reading. And reading and reading. And for as large as this book is, almost 900 pages, we could have had a second volume.
Wow.
That would have lost nothing for caliber of writing and quality. That we could have done a whole other volume of equal size. It was just an embarrassment of riches, trying to sort through what we would keep and what we would, maybe put off for another day.
Yeah, well, look, never say never. What are you doing next year? I want to ask you about something that you mentioned. So, Baldwin publishes this, the Letter from a Region in My Mind in 1962. At the time, the New Yorker was not publishing a lot of pieces about race, right? Like you talk about that in the foreword of the book. And by the time we get to this anthology, you had, like you said, an embarrassment of riches. In a lot of ways, this also feels like kind of the evolution of the New Yorker.
Oh, certainly.
In terms of its reckoning
certainly.
with race over time. Talk to me about why that matters. What struck you kind of about that evolution, that trajectory, and as more and more different Black voices, very diverse Black voices from across the country really start to come into the pages of the New Yorker, and what the impact you think of that has been.
Yeah, so early on, the New Yorker just wasn't interested in these matters, and it was started in 1925, and so it was very much reflective of the sensibilities of mainstream magazine publishing then, where it wasn't a thought, it wasn't an afterthought. In the 1930s, but particularly in the 1940s, you start to see more Black people show up as subjects in the magazine. And that was because the New Yorker branched out into jazz coverage. So especially in the 40s, you would see, profiles, reviews, kind of reportage about the jazz scene and its, relationship to, other kind of cultural things that the New Yorker thought was interesting. And it wasn't really until 1962, when Baldwin's letter appeared, that the New Yorker tackled race in any kind of direct way. And I've just imagined people innocently going to their mailboxes, or going to the lobbies of their buildings, in 1962, and opening up this piece from James Baldwin, which is, Baldwin at his most incendiary and his most provocative. And so that started a kind of opening, or kind of a fissure in the edifice, had once been, completely impossible for Black writers to surmount. And then there was this daylight, and the next significant development was that, Charlene Hunter Galt, whom, of course,
Absolutely.
as a native Georgian and as a journalist, you have two sets of connections to her. Of course, she famously, along with Hamilton Holmes, integrated the University of Georgia. And she was the subject of a piece by Calvin Trillin, or as everybody at the magazine calls him Bud. Bud Trillin wrote something about her, and through that connection, he mentioned to William Shawn, the editor of The New Yorker, that she was studying journalism. She was interested in pursuing journalism, and they arranged for her to begin at The New Yorker, kind of very, very low on the poll, and then, worked into writing small pieces, and then became a reporter for the Talk of the Town section. And of course, that's obviously, very crucial and very important development. Jervis Anderson, who we also have excerpted in here, was the second Black staff writer at The New Yorker. And then I think Jamaica Kincaid was the next. But, we're still counting like by individuals. And in the 80s, we got a lot of work from, and into the 90s, from Toni Morrison, who has two pieces in the collection, and also Henry Louis Gates, who I believe he might have the most in the collection. I have to go back and do like a head count, but I think he has 3 pieces in there. And Hilton Als came along at the same time, and Hilton we could have had a New Yorker anthology based on Hilton's writings, because he's done so much over such a long period of time.
Yeah. I mean, you are a native New Yorker. I'm very curious about what your relationship was to the New Yorker as a young writer.
Oh man, so the New Yorker was, I laugh about this now, because I, discovered the New Yorker when I was, I don't know, late teens, early 20s.
Okay.
And started reading it voraciously. And I was like, oh, I think I want to write for them. Like one day. I had no idea how audacious that was, how many people wanted to write for the New Yorker.
Of course, right.
Like, yeah. Right, what kind of work it would require to get to that place. But, and then when I got more serious about my writing, I think, Seymour Hersh, his work was important to me, but really Rick Hertzberg, whose comments were, to me, they still, I have, like, you can't see it probably because it's just outside the frame, but the collection of his essays, which I keep on my shelf, just such sterling examples of how the short essay as a form can and should work. I give it to my students still. I started, when I started kind of stalking the New Yorker and figuring out things, I bought David Remnick's collection of essays, of his reportage. I at some point bought Renita Adler's collection. Joseph Mitchell, who is New Yorker from the 30s and 40s, his collection, which was given to me actually by David Carr, the late David Carr.
Yeah.
And, all of that was just getting downloaded into my head about how great writing, could work. And, that was, it was foundational, to answer your question succinctly.
Yeah. Yeah, you were a student of the New Yorker long before you joined the staff. But look, eventually you do make it into the pages of the New Yorker, right? 2012. I know this story, but tell the folks watching about your debut for the magazine. How did it happen? What was the story?
So the first thing that I ever wrote for the New Yorker was a piece called Trayvon Martin and the Parameters of Hope. And, it was about, now Trayvon Martin's name, has a particular resonance, but this piece was about what was then a news blip, out of Florida, about this young man who had been shot under these, suspicious circumstances, and the question of what should be done. Should this person be arrested, the person who shot him? And, where are these things? It's curious. It was kind of a curious piece. But for me, the fact that it happened in the midst of a Black presidency talked about particular themes. Obama had, he couldn't really outright denounce racism because that would have been politically suicidal. So he replaced the word racism with cynicism. And if you go back in his political rhetoric, you can hear him, especially in the campaigns, he would say, oh, the cynics believe this. Well, the cynics are saying this. And invariably, he would describe something that people could also say was racist. And so it also meant the opposite of cynicism was hopefulness, which is what he represented. And at the same time, we had this person who was killed, this boy, a 17-year-old who was killed, and nothing seemed to happen, that the old dictates of impunity still applied. And so I said, we have hope, and there's certain parameters around that hope. And the way I got connected was that, my good friend Khalil Muhammad introduced me to David Remnick, and, we've gone to a conversation, and he said, you should write something for the magazine, which is, at that point I was 40, I think it was 40 or 41 years old. Said I wanted to write for the New Yorker for 20 years. And I was like, this guy is not serious. But I spoke with Amy Davidson, who's now a good friend. And she was like, oh, what are you thinking about? And she was like, what about this situation in Florida? Have you given any thought to that? And I was like, yeah, I can write something about that. And I was so completely shook about the whole thing.
Yeah. I think that's the medical term, shook.
Yeah, I was shook. I was shaken. I was shook. No, I was shook. But I went to the Schomburg and said, I'm going to write something here. I can write 1,000 words in Schomburg. I wrote half my doctoral dissertation in Schomburg. It's like, if you can write half a doctoral dissertation, you can write 1,000-word essay. And that was how that relationship began, and now almost a decade later.
Yeah. Part of your New Yorker lore, the legend of Jelani Cobb and the New Yorker.
Oh, please don't.
We're doing it. It's happening. So look, I mean, this was talked about in the introduction, but this anthology is intergenerational. You've got some of the same folks that we really, folks like us revere in this space, alongside of some of today's most respected and promising Black voices, including yours. And they almost seem to be in conversation across eras.
Yeah.
And yet I'm struck by just how much of the same subject matter they are all
right.
I wonder if you got the same feeling pouring through all of these and trying to cull them down, just looking across the ages at all of the things that all of these different Black voices could have been tackling, and yet so much of it was the same territory.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, I said in the introduction that this is not a book about race. It's a book about the community most commonly tasked with confronting it.
Yes.
And so even, like the profiles or some first-person essays, some narratives about family, they invariably, it's a subtle theme, or it's a kind of element that is there to the things that are much more on the surface. To things like, Luke Mogelson's coverage, an astounding coverage of Minneapolis and the aftermath of George Floyd's death, where it's right there on the surface. But, Stanley Crouch in, writing his jazz criticism and, his work for the New Yorker, it's not explicit, but that it's a kind of implicit theme, there. So yeah, we have like that resonant echo, of having to confront these questions. And I think that was part of, that was the spirit that the book came out of. And what I like to think of the book in two ways. The first was, what if there was a conversation between, Toni Morrison, Henry Louis Gates, Zadie Smith, Hilton Als, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Doreen St. Felix, all of these people, and it was moderated by myself and David Remnick, and so the other way I like to think of it is, if we have that first essay, the first piece in the collection is Baldwin's Letter from a Region in My Mind. How do all these pieces look refracted through the lens of what Baldwin was writing about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's some things. We end with Hilton Als' Homecoming, which is a very long and autobiographical piece that he wrote in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, that kind of is like a mirror image of Baldwin, like Baldwin turned inside out for this particular era.
Yeah.
And so, like, if we took this essay and thought of all these responses to it, in a kind of kaleidoscopic way, that might be another way of looking at the collection.
Yeah, that was the region of his mind. Absolutely. And P.S. sign me up for that dinner party. I'm there. Amazing. I want to remind people who are tuning in that we are definitely going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So if you have questions, please, please, please do submit those, and we will get to as many of them as we can. You mentioned, a couple of New Yorker writers upon whose work you drew as a young writer, whose work you still kind of reference today. I wonder how instructive it was for you to revisit some of this work, and just if there was anything in here that was particularly helpful to you, or has been particularly helpful to you since going through this particular project in your process. I'm thinking about some of these amazing profiles that are in here, or even just, some of the subject matter that we're having to revisit, unfortunately, in 2021, some of, or in terms of style or in terms of voice.
Yeah.
Not that you need any help with voice, by the way.
What'd you say?
Not that you need any help with voice, by the way.
So I think that really, but the interesting thing for me was reading my younger colleagues' work. So we have a long piece on New York City private school, like kind of prep programs that were supposed to take low-income kids and literally kind of walk them through the prep school process. And it's an examination of them, but it's also autobiographical because Vincent Cunningham, who wrote it, was a participant in one of these programs. Right. And so, it was really interesting revisiting that and looking at that, with the kind of bigger questions of education and equity and so on kind of looming around. And, one of my favorite, young colleagues, I say because she's still in her 20s, is Doreen St. Felix.
Yes, amazing.
Yeah, amazing. She has, really, so Doreen and Gia Tolentino came about the same time. And I was really like amazed by both of them because, they were in their 20s, in their mid 20s, and they had such command of their voice, yes, at that point.
In a way that so many of us did not when we.
Yeah. It takes a while to understand like what you sound like.
Well, and it takes permission to even.
It takes permission, right?
As a writer or as a journalist, I'll say for myself, permission to even think that you can have a voice that anybody will care about or want to hear.
It is.
They have that. They absolutely have that.
They absolutely have that, and just have it in spades. And so I was really drawn to a lot of that work that younger people were doing. Alexis Okewo, who
Vanity Fair next month.
Yeah, who has another, right, who's in the collection too. And so those pieces were really interesting to me. Another piece, which I had not read before, we got this pile of material to go through for the collection, was Sarah Broom's amazing piece, The Yellow House, which is, about her family's experience in the midst of and aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And so there's a lot in there that, I had the opportunity to read and kind of respond to and so on. I will tell you one piece that I continue to lament that did not make the cut.
I was going to ask you, was there anything in there that you wish had been in there, or that what wakes you up at night like, oh, we should have had that?
There's a bunch of stuff in it. So I will say this, like, it sounds like this at the risk of sucking up, but I promise you I'm not. But David had this profile of Aretha Franklin, which was so good, so good. And he was like, oh, no, I'm not going to be in this. And I was like, David, it's like, this has to really be in here. Like, it's Aretha. It's like you at your best. I think just let me put this in. And he was like, no. We went back and forth. I tried to sneak it in, all these things.
That's so interesting. I mean, because obviously you are in here, and he was clearly involved in this
which was funny, because we're the opposite, because I was trying to pull my pieces out. And he was like, no, Jelani, this has to stay.
Wow.
And so, like those chipmunks from the Warner Brothers cartoons, they're like super friendly. They're like, no, after you, like after you, like it was like that. And so, we kind of went back and forth, but that piece didn't get in. There were a lot of really interesting pieces that Skip did, in the 90s. And so it wasn't so much about like not, like what, we wanted to keep in there, but it was like we had like a whole bunch of stuff from him, and we're like, okay, if we're going to publish like only 3 of these pieces, which will they be? And same thing with Khalifa Sana, who, one of my favorite pieces of his is his profile of Jay-Z. And so we got that in, but in order to get that, we had to cut another profile. I'm forgetting who it was right now, but it was like another profile that I was really enamored of. And so we're like, oh, do we keep it? Do we not? So there are a lot of things that, I look back on and go like, oh, I wish, we had done it this way, or.
Yeah. I'm thinking about your 2012 Trayvon Martin piece, and just kind of what somebody like you writing for somewhere like the New Yorker, platforming those kinds of stories to a national audience, why it matters that the matter of Black lives is something that is now a much more regular feature in this historically very white, very New York centric publication.
What's funny about this is, when I wrote this piece, and I felt conflicted at first because I had done so much like race coverage early on. But I also was like, I have a PhD in American history, specifically African-American history. I know the landscape here, and like the geography of this world.
And what writer doesn't write what they know? Right.
And so at the same time, at least online, which is not necessarily a representation of like the real world. And early on, there was like pushback, like, oh, like, why is this guy like doing this stuff, and so on. And it's funny because, when I was still naive enough and silly enough to actually read comments, the New Yorker has since gotten rid of its comment section, but I read like a whole stream of people who just went after me about stuff. It might have been Ferguson coverage or something prior to that. And someone was like, why does this guy keep writing about this? And someone in the comments said, it's called a beat. And I was like, there it is. I've been writing about this subject matter that there's a theme, and I'm trying to create this collection of work around that theme.
Yeah. And also that this is our country's collective history.
Right.
So it should be reflected in one of the most storied and respected journalism publications in the country. It should be, right? Because these should be everyone's stories. I want to ask you if you can talk about the photo that's on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
It's very striking, and I know there's a story behind it, and I know that you are a lover of photography, so I would be remiss if I did not ask you to talk to our audience about the choice of that photo, why it was important to you to use that photo, and what it is that you want people to understand about what they're seeing.
So that image came from the photographer Devin Allen, who is this amazing talent. I think Devin is still like in his 20s.
Yes, Baltimore.
In Baltimore, based in Baltimore. Such a like prodigious talent. And that's from the immediate aftermath of Freddie Gray's death. And if you can see the image, I would
right over your shoulder.
I would, like, if you zoom in, if you can, you can see it. It's a picture of an American flag, and the American flag has on it the names of numerous Black people who have been killed at the hands of police. And so, Freddie Gray's name is prominently there, and, Michael Brown and from Ferguson and other people. And so, and I was in Baltimore, interestingly enough. I was in Washington, D.C. For something completely different for the New Yorker. And David, I want to say he called me on my cell phone and said, can you swing by Baltimore on your way back? And, I got off the train. I was in D.C., got off the train in Baltimore. And then this was like the day after Freddie Gray died, or maybe like at most the second day. And, the city was hot. There were all these kind of things going on. And so I saw the scenes that Devin Allen was out photographing. Mm-hmm. And so that was when we went through, honestly, about 30 different like suggested covers. And I kept going, nope, that's not it. No, maybe. And there was another one that we liked, but then it was a copyright issue. And then we landed on the Devin image, and I was like, no, that's it. That's like perfect. That has to be it. And so that's how we came to be. And the title, which is, a riff on Black Lives Matter, the matter of Black lives, is taken from a profile that I wrote of Alicia Garza, who was one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that's how, the books, the original, if you want like trivia about it, the original title of the book was going to be Precisely as Bright and as Dark, which is a line from Baldwin's essay where he says, the future of America is precisely as bright and as dark as the future of the Negro.
Yeah. No, I think that photo was the perfect choice too. And it is just very captivating. And, I think it's a reminder of that moment too, right? I mean, I think that we are in a time where, so much is happening, has happened, that it can be easy to forget about, what came before. It can be easy for us to kind of lose the details of that. And so much of the work that is in here does not allow us to do that, right?
Do you think, I don't know, for you in your work, and you have covered civil rights, for AP and for, other publications, you've done a lot of, do you feel like we've reached a generally higher plane in this conversation than we were at a decade ago?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that there were certainly people who were doing this work, and maybe it wasn't being amplified nearly as much because you didn't have social media, for example. But what I think is different is that the chorus is so much louder, right? You had Baldwin in the pages of the New Yorker as this kind of singular voice, and now, here you are at the New Yorker, and you look around and you have colleagues that look like you. You didn't have that, right?
Yeah, that's like,
Baldwin didn't really have that.
Yeah, I know. I was in Khalifa's office one time, and Hilton Als came by, and
you had a quorum.
The three of us, we had a quorum, in Black America, if there are 3 of us anywhere, we get to actually cast ballots and, issue referenda and all that other stuff. So, we had a quorum there. But no, when the 3 of us were in Khalifa's office, and I jokingly said, in South Carolina, under the old codes, they would consider 3 or more Black people in one place as the definition of a slave revolt. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, not that, whatever, it's like, but it was like in having a quorum of people, like,
there weren't that many of you.
Yeah, but there weren't.
Yeah.
But the funny thing, I think, is that I found that to be, for me at least, mirroring this development, which I think relates back to the Obama era, where publications looked around and were like, oh, wow, there are more Black people living in the White House than there are working for our publication. And also the rise of Ta-Nehisi and a handful of other people, which made people recognize that there really was this pool of Black talent that, of course, I would include Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jamel Bowie and Jenna Wortham, and of course Wesley Morris and Wesley Lowry and Adam Serwer and Okoto Afori-Atta, and it's a whole list of people in addition to my colleagues at the New Yorker. And I feel like the decibel on that conversation has changed, as well as I think that there has been some movement in terms of the caliber of the conversation. Mm-hmm. That there's been a critical mass of information and work that's been done such that, like, the public is talking about race in ways that we wouldn't have anticipated a decade ago.
I think that I will agree with that. I will also say that the elevation of so many more Black women, I think, and also LGBTQ, mm-hmm. other marginalized voices, mm-hmm. is also something that feels very different about now as compared to then. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to go to the Q&A room here. Not yet. We're going to keep going because that's what we do every day, whether we're on a screen or not.
Yeah.
I go back to what I was asking you before. I mean, other stories that you have done for the New Yorker that really help to kind of to shine a light on stories that maybe, without you and some other folks writing about these topics at a national level, but for that kind of coverage would not have gotten the attention.
Here's an interesting thing. And this is not about, like, current New Yorker stuff solely. It's not exclusively about current New Yorker stuff. When I covered Dylann Roof's trial in South Carolina, I looked up the last lynching, kind of last recognized lynching in South Carolina, and that was 1947, when Strom Thurmond was governor. And that lynching was atypical, because there were actually charges brought, which would almost never happen.
Right.
But it was indicative of these dynamics where the state of South Carolina had to be concerned about appearances. World War II had ended. People were thinking about investment and, like, luring capital to the state and so on. And people started to think that these kinds of actions looked barbaric. And so there was a trial. It was a complete show trial. There was no, like, real chance of anybody being convicted, and nobody was. But the mere fact that they had to go through the pretense of caring about justice made it complicated and interesting. Now, as I was writing that piece, I did not know about Rebecca West's famous opera in Greenville piece in the New Yorker, which had run in 1947. And when I was looking at this, I thought, like, wow, there's this dialogue, we're talking about two incidents that are both horrific, and we're mirroring the way in which those things were metabolized in the same place, the same state, across the span, of the decades. The other thing about that piece that was really astounding to me was, you and I talked about this when it happened, but I was really thrown by the experience of covering that trial. First, in a very kind of curious twist, we were, for me, I was seated one row behind Dylann Roof. And usually, people want more space, between the defendant.
Or that row is for the family, or
that rose for, no. I was staring
Right
at the back of his head, right, for this whole trial. And it was very unsettling. The other thing that happened was that at the end of the trial, I'd come to know Malcolm Graham, whose sister, Cynthia Graham Hurd, had been killed in the church, in Emmanuel AME Church. And at the end of the trial, when Roof was convicted and sentenced to death, family members came out and began speaking. They were out the kind of square, the kind of courthouse square. And Malcolm said, and I was friendly with him at this point, said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life letting the world know who my sister was. So I'd been in South Carolina for 2.5 weeks, covering this trial. It was very exhausting, hearing the testimony, seeing the crime scene photos, which were as macabre as people would ever imagine. All this, the entire experience. So I left the next morning, and as a coincidence, I had a speaking engagement in San Francisco, which I thought I was going to have to cancel because of the trial, but the trial concluded. I was able to keep a commitment. So I flew out at 5:30 in the morning, on the first flight I could get. I was so eager to get out of Charleston. Landed in LaGuardia, hopped in a taxi, went from LaGuardia to JFK. At JFK, I am in the airport for a little while, then I hop on a flight from JFK to San Francisco. Land in San Francisco, and I realized that I have not spoken a word to another human being all day. And so just to break the silence, I start talking to the bellman, who is, at the kind of entrance of the hotel. He says, "Where are you coming in from?" And I said, "I'm coming in from New York, but before that, I was in Charleston, South Carolina." And he said, "Really? I'm from Charleston. What brought you to Charleston?" And I said, "I was there to cover the trial of Dylann Roof." And we get this kind of stricken, really, look on his face, which is how I described it later. He said, "That young man took somebody very important away from me." And I said, "Who?" He said, "My childhood librarian. Her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd." And I was shaken by that, because I'd started the day on the East Coast of the country in Charleston, which is a port city, so I'm right by the water. By the end of the day, I was in San Francisco, another port city, on the opposite side of the country. Literally, I couldn't have gone 2 miles further in Charleston without being in the water. And I couldn't have gone, a mile further in San Francisco without being in the water. So I was across the entire expanse of the country. And the first person I spoke to was someone directly impacted by what I had been trying to get away from in Charleston. And so I thought that spoke to the nature of these questions and the nature of these issues in this country. Whenever we talked about race and covering race, that was always at the front of my mind, and saying that this is not something that can be sequestered or segregated to one particular place. It covers the expanse of the whole nation, just like the ripples of that horrible act covered the expanse of the whole nation.
Yeah. But also that this woman, was the focus of the last person that you spoke to in Charleston and the first person that you would speak to in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about, Black women, the Black women whose voices have been amplified, like I said, in this kind of modern era of discourse on race in our journalism and American writing. Quite a few Black women are featured in this anthology.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that was a deliberate choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you about that. If it was deliberate, why were you intentional about raising the voices of so many women who have been chronicled in the New Yorker?
Yeah, because I think one, like there was just this astounding amount of great work, from them. But two, it was important because a lot of times we have these conversations and it's purely about like men. Like the presumption is that that having Black male representation means that you've like represented the whole community. But we, have obviously the great eminence, Toni Morrison, in the pages. We have Chimamanda Adichie, represented in there. Charlene Hunter Galt, who is in the collection. Of course, Jamaica Kincaid, who we had to kind of like call and kind of like the other person who has such a huge amount of work that they've done. But her essay, Putting Myself Together, I really, really liked. It's an autobiographical essay. And it's such a Jamaica Kincaid piece, so she's in there. Danielle Allen, who writes an amazing piece about the life and death of her young cousin, is in there. And of course, I mentioned Sarah Broom, in her piece on Hurricane Katrina. Then, Alexis and Doreen and, all of these folk, and Zadie, there's just an astounding amount of great work. Alexis wrote a profile of Sadia Hartman, really kind of insightful and brilliant academic, who happens to also be my colleague at Columbia University. And so, yeah, we were very happy about that too. Like that was, one of the things that we were, it's a good feeling because when we looked at the book at the conclusion, when it came out, sometimes you like, oh, well, did we get this right? Did we not get it right? I thought that we had gotten a good representation of what we set out to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wonder at the end of this process, what you took away from being on this journey, going through this archive and coming up with this amazing collection of writing, what you came away from it with, what you hope that other people who get this anthology and go through this anthology and probably will come back to it again and again, what they get from it.
I wanted it to be kind of like a Norton anthology, which is something that you can always come back to, both for enjoyment, but for the pedagogical quality. I want young writers to go to this collection and say, oh, wow, here are all these examples of work that, can be done. I also saw in the chat, there's a question about, was there anything about the collection that surprised me? Well, here's one thing that did surprise me. I'd read like earlier New Yorker stuff, but the thing that I didn't realize, and which David Remnick confirmed for me, was that people were basically writing books, and when I say that, I mean literally, people would write these gigantic stories that would very easily we think like now 6,000 words or 10,000 words is like extreme, but they're like 30,000 word pieces.
Wow.
In the New Yorker. Now, this was also emblematic of a very different era because, publications were just flush with advertising money.
Sure.
They had to find something to do with all the money. And so, they would run these huge serialized pieces, and then it would be like a very short step from, a serialized piece of 60 or 80,000 words into a book that winds up being 100 or 120,000 words. And so that was, one thing that people would do. And I was kind of shocked as we went further back. It just, when we started editing stuff, they're like a couple pieces, like Jervis Anderson's piece, that we really, really trimmed significantly. And also Rebecca West's piece, Opera in Greenville, which we ran a part of. Calvin Trillin has a piece, which is, Letter from Jackson, which we cut. There's a point where he just wound up on an airplane with Martin Luther King and starts overhearing or eavesdropping on this conversation King was having.
As one would.
With this racist passenger who's sitting next to him, saying that, he is causing all the trouble. And the way that he handles this person is just really very adroit. And so that's in the middle of this much longer thing. And
it's just an aside, like that whole.
That's like an aside. But David and I were like, that is a piece. That's a piece in itself. And because the exchange is like maybe 4 or 5 pages long. And I was like, we just want to lift this and put this in.
But I digress.
Right, but I digress. And so that was kind of surprising. And also what was interesting is that I expected a dearth of work because of like what the New Yorker's early history was. But by the time we got, even though it wasn't a prominent theme, as I kind of wrote in the introduction, people were in no danger of confusing the New Yorker with Ebony magazine. But things appeared regularly enough that there wound up being cumulatively quite a large amount of work. And so David and I would have these meetings on Tuesday evenings at 9 p.m. And so it was, Tuesday, because we'd kind of come through the weekend, did like a bunch of stuff on Monday. Tuesday is the day that you have a little bit more flexibility. And then at 9 o'clock at night, because, my very belligerent and loud children be in bed.
Adorable is the word.
Right. And so we would talk from like 9 to 11, and we would read all weekend and kind of mark up stuff and then have a conversation on Tuesday night about what was in, what was out, and we had this rolling table of contents that we would literally X things out on and then add something else in.
Yeah. Tuesdays with Rimnick, apparently one of the other.
Yeah, no.
Another question from the chat here: Are there other young and up and coming Black writers whose work you've been watching who have not yet appeared in the New Yorker, but who you hope will in the future? That's interesting.
Yeah. Yes, I don't necessarily know if I should name all these folk, but I like Caleb Gale's work. And he's a really thoughtful, and talented writer, and also Hanif Abdul-Rakib.
Yes, absolutely.
Whose criticism is getting really recognized, and now he just got a MacArthur, so that's like really significant. Yeah. So and I like his work a lot, and so maybe we'll see both of them in the pages, at some point.
Well, one more. Having delved so deeply into the New Yorker's coverage of these issues over the past century, what do you predict or hope for the future of coverage on race in the New Yorker and in other media?
For reasons that I'm not entirely, for reasons that are sometimes depressing to me, I think that we will be having more of these conversations.
Sure.
The nature of the last 5 years, really we could say decade, but the nature of the last 5 years in particular in American life have pointed to an inescapable conclusion that Black people by and large have recognized, and I think white people by and large have been more reluctant to recognize, which is that the centrality of race as a vulnerable point in American democracy. And when people think about that, they're like, oh, this guy writes about race, he's obsessed with it. I'm like, okay, the one time that this country was almost destroyed, it was over a conflict of whether or not Black people would be citizens or whether they would be bought and sold in the public square. That nearly destroyed this country. and 700,000 plus people died in pursuit of some resolution of it. And so that should have taught us to confront these matters, directly rather than obliquely, but we haven't reached, I think, that level of understanding. And so consequently, we are where we are. And the efficacy of dividing people by race, as we've just seen reiterated in Virginia, is still with us. And the profits that can be reaped, by sowing that kind of division are still apparent. And so I think we'll be having more of these conversations. I hope that for all of that critical mass of talent that we just talked about, that there are even more voices, and that people can address this issue in the sophisticated, nuanced way. As I say to my students, I want people to be able to write about race and cover race with the same level of depth and clarity and professionalism that people do when they're covering the Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, The Matter of Black Lives is, I think it is essential reading. I hope that people enjoyed this conversation. I'm so glad that we were able to have it. And thank you everybody so much for tuning in, for your excellent questions, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you to everyone in the audience for spending your evening with us and joining in this important conversation. Please learn more about this book and purchase The Matter of Black Lives at the link that I posted in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night and keep reading. Take care, everyone.